We are starting on Persian Standard Time. That is only half an hour late, 15 minutes over the Italian Standard Time. And so I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture to the University of California, Irvine. It's my distinct honor to welcome you to the Payravi Conference on Ancient Iran 1, along with my colleague, Professor Dr. Robert Rollinger. This is the first of 5 conferences with their subsequent publications to map out the history of the Iranian plateau and that of Iran from what the poster has, the beginning to the 7th century CE. The second conference will take place hopefully next year on the Achaemenids, the subsequent one on the Seleucids, and the subsequent one on the Arsacids, and then finally with the Sasanian Empire. These conferences and their publication is in memory of the late Mr. Ali Asghar Payravi, whom you have his bio on the back of the program, who was an enthusiast and lover of ancient history in general and ancient Iranian history. I would like to thank Ms. Payravi here, who is with us, and Mr. Bijan Farhad for their support and generosity for making these conferences take place. Thank you very much. Now to our conference, to try to put together the history of the Iranian plateau before its imperial phase is a daunting task. Archaeologists, we have some among us today, philologists, and historians have worked on the various aspects of the autochthonous civilizations from Sialk to Shahdad to Jiroft and beyond. There are probably very few literary evidence compared to later time in Iranian history, and we're mainly dependent on Mesopotamian and Elamite world to shed light on the history of the plateau to a large extent. I think still we have only bits and pieces of the entire puzzle. Hence, it's beneficial for historians, archaeologists, philologists, and others to come together and rethink and organize to view the history of the plateau before the coming of the Achaemenids. And I would like to thank my colleague, Robert Rollinger, who is going to give the closing talk about our project. Is this for this reason that we've come together to put these conferences together, and we hope that these papers are published in due time in the volume 1. And with that, I ask Professor Rollinger if he has something to say.
Yes. So I also want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank, of course, all the colleagues who are going to give their talks here, and especially thank to my dear friend Turaj for organizing this fantastic conference together. I think, as he said, it is a daunting task to deal with, let's say, pre-imperial Iranian history. Also the big question, what is Iranian history? How shall we define pre-imperial Iranian history is already a challenge, and that immediately brings us into the start of the conference and the first talk, the keynote speaker, Josef Wiesehofer, who will give his keynote lecture on Iranian history versus history of Iran in pre-Islamic times. Approaches, concepts, and problems. Please, Josef.
Yes, Said is coming right now.
You will put this up. Or if not, I will.
Good luck. He's going to be reading, so it's going to be a bit different.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to give the keynote speaker of the first of those 5 conferences here in Irvine. First of all, let me wish all the Iranians here in the room a happy Nowruz, and my dearest thanks go to Raj and Robert for organizing this conference and for having me invited to it. And what I try to do is to make you acquainted with the problems involved in dealing with Iranian history or the history of Iran in pre-Islamic times. Until I retired in 2016, one of my tasks as a university teacher for ancient history at the University of Kiel in northern Germany was to offer a lecture on Greek history at regular intervals. Until today, Greek and Roman history, as you all know, are still regarded as the core of my discipline and have to be tested in examinations and to be taught by my former students as teachers at German schools. In the first hour of my lecture, I used to ask my students the following question: would you like me to give you my view of the history of Greece or that of Greek history in the following weeks? This question was usually taken note of by the students with astonishment or even confusion. What should be the difference between the history of Greece and Greek history? Of course, you know the answer. The first case is about the history of the regions for which the ancients used the Latin term Graecia or the Greek term Hellas. The second about the people who described themselves as Hellenes or were called Greci by others. It remains to be asked, however, whereupon Greekness should be anchored: at language, cultural preferences, descent. On the other hand, a history of Greece, like a Greek history, is always determined by what people in modern Greece or elsewhere understand by it. What I tried to show in the following lecture hours was that to many Greeks in antiquity, what appeared as Patris, their homeland, was their specific polis, rather than Hellas as a whole, or the community of all the Hellenes. That the poleis kai ethne of archaic and classical Greece were not characterized by actual or imagined linguistic, cultural, or even ethnic homogeneity, but by their polyethnic and multicultural character. And that the hundreds of citizen communities, poleis, in Hellas, Western Asia, or the Magna Graecia, that is Italy, Sicily, and so on, feature not only similarities on a linguistic or cultural level, but also numerous peculiarities and specifics. On the other hand, the dispute over Alexander's and the ancient Macedonians' legacy in today's nation-states of Greece and Macedonia, which is absurd from a historical point of view, shows that history can also serve as a political argument. In the minutes that follow, I would like to make it clear to you that the questions I asked in my lecture on Greek history are also important for history of Iran or Iranian history in antiquity. It will therefore come as no surprise to you that I've already asked them in my lectures in Kiel on the history of Iran and the ancient Near East, and that I've already discussed them intensively with my dear friend and colleague Robert Rollinger, one of our hosts here today. According to the definitions I've just given, a history of ancient Iran should therefore be understood as the history of those territories that in antiquity were called Iran or Iran Shah, while Iranian history should be meant as the history of those people who in antiquity described themselves as Aryans, Iranians, or were described by others as such. Here too, it remains to be asked what being Iranian is all about. Ancestry, language, cultural preferences. In view of the long precedence of the spoken over the written word in Iran and the poverty of local written tradition, even the foreign or the modern assessment of affiliation or identity may be the determining factor. At the same time, however, Iran's history is also the history of a historical greater area, which we define today as such, because it has been historically and culturally entangled and trans-regionally linked for millennia. In this sense, there is also a history of Iran before Iran Shah. As far as Iran's history is concerned, one could also think of only historically examining the much smaller territory of today's Republic of Iran, but this makes little sense for antiquity. A problem in itself is the history of modern historical terms such as Iran and Persia. I will therefore not discuss it here. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of the lands with all tribes, king on this great earth also far off. Hystaspes' son, an Achaemenid, a man from Parsa, son of a man from Parsa, an Aryan of Aryan descent. In several of his inscriptions, as here in his upper epitaph from Naqshi Rustam, Darius I places himself in group-specific contexts and gives an indication of his multiple identities. He is the son of Hystaspes, Greek, Vishtaspa, a member of the clan of the Achaemenids, a Persian like Hystaspes, and an Iranian with an appropriate genealogical background. The adjectification of the term Arya takes us one step further. In the only epigraphical document on this subject, Darius Bisotun 489, the attribute serves as a language designation and is, as was rightly pointed out, comparable to Bactrian Ariao in Aryan in the Rabatak inscription, which relates to the rule of the Kushan emperor Kanishka and gives clues on the dynasty's genealogy. In his report from Bisotun, Darius, as Rahim Shayegan rightly pointed out, distinguishes three forms of res gestae: the physical, written inscription itself, Old Persian dipi, Elamite tupi, which can be seen and read aloud, but can also be destroyed and must therefore be preserved. A version, or as the case may be, several versions of the inscription, Old Persian dipi sisra, Elamite tupi me, including the Aryan, that is the Old Persian one, which can be reproduced, read out, and distributed in written form. And finally, a report, Old Persian Handuga, which should orally be made known, but can also be concealed. The community of Iranians from which Darius claimed to be descended and to which he professed himself as a man from Parsa is also recognizable by the fact that it defined certain gods, not least Ahura Mazda, as its own, and accordingly postulated a close relationship between them and the Iranians. In the Elamite version of the Bisotun inscription, Ahura Mazda is called God of the Aryans. However, one should be careful not to play off so-called native Iranian against foreign Elamite gods, for example in the Achaemenid Persis contexts, as they appear in the Persepolis texts. Speaking out against a dichotomy between an Elamite and an Iranian religious sphere in southwestern Iran, Wouter Henkelmann, for example, gave good reasons why the Elamite and the Iranian deities, if you like, might together have been regarded as indigenous and Persian by the inhabitants of Persis, Fars. Henkelmann was also able to clarify something else. Cyrus and Darius both possessed something like a Persian identity, derived from a long process of Persian ethnogenesis, even though the latter, perhaps for reasons of tradition, only explicitly appears in epigraphic sources with Darius. Cyrus's references to Anshan in the Cyrus cylinder, or Darius's to the Aryans, are then at a similar level, since under the given historical circumstances, rival Neo-Elamite rulers in Susa here, under Cyrus, an Iranian world in the meantime opened up by expansion there, under Darius. They are references to a more comprehensive world of traditions and claims that had become significant for both the empire and Persian rule. But Cyrus and Cambyses were no less Persian than Darius and Xerxes. And Darius and Xerxes were no less a product of an Elamite Iranian milieu than Cyrus and Cambyses. In Henkelmann's words, I quote him, both Cyrus and Darius unquestionably represent, each in his own way, phases in the development of the same new self-awareness formed over a long incubation period, that of the people of Parsa. They found, within the cultural matrix of early Persia, elements of various origin that could be used and transformed to shape and proclaim their newly acquired self. In the end, it is not important whether these elements were Elamite or Indo-Iranian, but only that a fruitful encounter between various traditions led to a new dynamic and eventually to the emergence of the Persian Empire. End of quote. Arya, as is generally known, became a decidedly political term only in the early Sasanian period. As Albert de Jong clearly pointed out in a recent contribution, it was not so much the language that determined a person's Iranian identity as his ancestry, cultural imprint, and not least his religious conviction. In the early Sasanian concept of Iran, a special role is assigned to the royal ancestors, Middle Persian Niyagan, the Greek version of the inscriptions Papoi, and the forebears, Middle Persian Ahinagan, Greek Progonoi, and their territories, as well as to Zoroastrian religious traditions and practices. Specific means and institutions were employed to strengthen the idea that the ruler and his subjects in Iran Shahr shared the same destiny. Symbolic references, for example, an era starting from 205 6 CE, an iconography closely connected to the royal inscriptions and also underlining the king's close relationship to the gods. Special rites and practices, like the lighting of royal and other fires, as well as donations for the welfare of the souls of deceased and living persons. And finally, important memorial places and monuments, as for instance, the sacred shrine of Anahita at Istakhar, the cliff of Nakshi Rustam, you can see here, and the towers, both there and at Payravi. Turaj Daryai, our second gentle host of today, has made clear that three different concepts of Iran were current in Sasanian times. First, the pre-Sasanian Avestan notion, in which Iran was part of the Huanira climb. Second, the Iran of the early Sasanian kings, that is, where the Iranagan lived and where their kings ruled. And finally, the wider territory that Khosrow II tried to bring under his control in the beginning of the 7th century, and which he attempted to administer. The process of the creation of a specific identity, both for the members of the Sasanian dynasty and for their subjects in Iran Shahr, had not only inclusive but also exclusive features. Excluded from the close relationship between the king and the Iranagan were the inhabitants of An-Iran, that is, the areas that Shapur I and his successors had been able to conquer only temporarily, and all non-subjects of the King of Kings. In Shapur's res gestae, the latter category included first of all the subjects of Rome, but later came to include also those who were not willing to serve the kings and sustain the empire. Turaj has also convincingly shown that the Manichaeans, among others, belonged to this group of non-Iranians. By contrast, the members of the Parthian clans who had changed sides in time or who had been allowed to remain in office by the new lords for political reasons were still considered worthy members of this imagined community of Iranians, to which belonged also the Jewish and later on, as we will see, Christian subjects of the empire. Surely, terms like Iran and An-Iran, which had their roots in Zoroastrianism, had religious connotations, as the first was considered to be under divine protection, that is, a domain of the Yazdan, and the latter to be a place of idols, Divan. The creation of a special Iranian identity is to be seen in connection with similar tendencies toward regionalism in the Roman Empire. That this Sasanian concept of an ethnically, culturally, and religiously self-contained Iranian community depended exclusively on royal ideology has correctly been postulated with reference to the numerous ethno-linguistic and religious minorities in the Sasanian Empire, not least in its most fertile regions, like Mesopotamia. However, such a distinct Sasanian Iranism was a big drawback. It stood in the way of developing an integrative imperial ideology, which, as is shown by the Achaemenid royal inscriptions and reliefs, presents the ruler and all his subjects as a community of interests, chosen, fostered, and legitimized by the gods. This new form of Iranism, which, not least in times of crisis, succeeded in strengthening thoughts of a clear distinction between friend and foe, stood in the way of a dissemination of an Iranian and Zoroastrian system of thought. Shapur I's temporary interest in Mani's universal message, hinted at in Manichaean literature, may have been an expression of royal discontent with the lack of integrative power of Zoroastrianism on an imperial level. According to Richard Payne, in the course of time, the idea of a hierarchy of religions developed, according to which Iranian Christianity was no longer outside the realm, but was part of it. In the Christian hagiographies, therefore, criticism is directed primarily against the Zoroastrian clerics and less against the ruler or the aristocracy. And the fact that the Christian faith apparently also appeared attractive to members of the Sasanian elite is proven by the example of the House of the Mihran, for which 2 cases of conversions are documented. The Sasanians began to use the term Iran Shahr to emphasize to their subjects both the experiences shared in former times and the common cultural traditions of Iran. These integrative factors were probably meant in part to prevent dangerous regional or cultural religious particularisms within Iran and to strengthen the Sasanians' rule. Under the influence of the concrete danger of Roman and Hephthalite Turkish pressure on the western and eastern frontiers of the empire, the oral traditions of Sasanian Iran, as well as its representational art, condensed already existing patterns of external threats into the image of an eternal enmity between Iran and Rum or Turan. Iran, including Kushan Shahr, and An-Iran were, to use a term of Reinhard Koselleck, juxtaposed as asymmetric counterterms. Last but not least, the ethnogenesis of the Persians has taught us that the history of the territories, which were later grouped together by its Iranian-speaking inhabitants under the name Land of the Aryans, Iranians, did not begin with the Thespids and Achaemenids, not even with the immigration of Iranian-speaking population groups to the highlands. Without the influence of the Elamite high culture, the Parsa of the second half of the first millennium BC is incomprehensible, and Elamite traditions remained effective in the Elamite heartland around Susa and in the Elymais far beyond the Achaemenid period, as Dan Potts has clearly shown. Similar developments apply to other parts of Iran, and their cultures too, were the results of various locally, regionally, and trans-regionally shared cultural codes, which were adopted and re-imbued with meaning in various local social contexts. Cultures are never pure and unambiguous at any time, as essentializing cultural concepts and even concepts of hybrid cultures presuppose. And the diversity of different cultural elements does not suggest ethnically pure and culturally precisely definable individuals or groups, as names or a language situation do not imply unambiguous ethnic conditions. Thus, for example, the later phenomenon of Persophone has meanwhile been freed from the label of an allegedly anti-Arab or even anti-Islamic act of resistance, and rightly been interpreted as a special expression of Islamic cultural existence. The history of Iran, or the history of the Iranians, do not only refer to diversities within Iran, but also to contexts that go beyond the Iranian borders. In Achaemenid, Hellenistic, Parthian, and Sasanian times, there were Iranian, or more precisely, Iranophone groups, or groups characterized by preferences for Iranian cultural elements or religious ideas outside Iran. In Achaemenid and Hellenistic times, for example, in Anatolia, in Parthian and Sasanian times in Central Asia or India, and Hellenistic kings, Parthian monarchs, Romans and Sasanians, they all made a lot of meaning through the evolving concept of Persia, as Rolf Strothmann and Miguel John Versluis, as well as their collaborators, were able to show in their book on Persianism. Last but not least, the history of the Iranian great empires of antiquity, as Robert Rollinger has been able to make clear in numerous contributions, can only be fully understood if viewed as an integral part of the history of the ancient Near East. And as the caesuras of 539 BC and 330 BC, so often emphasized in handbooks on the history of the ancient Near East, appear more and more arbitrary, one may, in my opinion, also reconsider the meaning of the historical and disciplinary caesura of 651 AD. And the history of the ancient Near East, in contrast to what Hegel and his adepts postulated, is not only worth exploring as the prehistory of Greece and Rome, or in its relations with the world dominated by Hellas and Rome or Constantinople. In addition to such East-West relations, there were always political and cultural developments that remained in the Near East or radiated from there to the east, to Central Asia, to India, to China, or to the south, to Arabia, and in doing so crossed borders other than those familiar to us in terms of space and time. I quote, "The Turkish parliament has withdrawn Leyla Zana, a prominent Kurdish MP and winner of the Sakharov Prize, from the National Assembly in Ankara. The reason for this was the continued absence of the member of the pro-Kurdish HDP from the eastern Turkey's Agri, the state news agency Anadolu reported. Zana was awarded the 1995 Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, the European Parliament's Human Rights Prize. Zana had caused a sensation at the swearing-in ceremony after the parliamentary elections in 2015. She had changed the text of the oath by placing it on the, I quote, great nation of Turkey, instead of the great Turkish nation. Many Kurds reject the phrase great Turkish nation because they believe it excludes minorities. Because Zana did not take her oath in the prescribed form, she did not get a vote in parliament despite her seat." End of quote. As you can infer from this quote from the Austrian daily newspaper Der Standard of January the 12th, 2018, the grammatical distinction between subject and attribute can also become a political issue. As you all know, the question of who belongs to the nation also plays a role in intra-Iranian discussions on the relationship between minority rights as part of human rights and the status of so-called protected minorities today. The question was asked whether by basing their political representation in parliament on their religious denomination, Jews, Christians and Zoroastrians are not set apart from the rest of the nation. Some points are reminiscent of the discussions in the Zoroastrian and Christian literature of late antique Iran, and the parallels between the Manichaeans, who at that time were not granted Iranian status, and the denial of central human and civil rights for certain religious or ethnic minorities in many countries of the world today are also becoming obvious. However, as David Jacob has rightly stated in his recent book on minority rights in Turkey, the entire society of a state should be regarded as, I quote, in principle, culturally diverse. The principle and hence the prospect of protecting minorities must therefore be a different one. Society in a state is, and was already before the age of nationalism, religiously and linguistically heterogeneous. If a linguistic or religious group is dominant because of its number or political power, the other communities must be supported to maintain their language and culture, and thus the diversity of the state. This protection is ultimately necessary not only for the cultural enrichment of a society and for the respect for the human dignity of individuals, but to secure stability and peace within a state in the long term." End of quote. Signs of such a policy can already be found among Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sasanians. I thank you for your attention.